Okay, so the abiotic factors are the foundation. They're what the ecosystem will adapt to, the organisms in there. We'll talk later about natural selection and that whole process by which that takes place. But they are, like I said, they're the foundation. This is why you're going to have cactuses in the desert. This is why you're going to have fig trees in the rainforest, and coral in tropical latitudes, and kelp in colder latitudes. Because of these organisms. Well, what you'll have for these different things are ranges of amounts, temperature ranges, how much sunlight you get, how much nutrients, etc. And then what we'll see is that each organism also has a range called its range of tolerance. So what happens is that the range of tolerance has to be within the range of these different physical variables in order for that organism to survive and do well there. So, but those are kind of subjects for, like I said, for a later topic, because that's all about natural selection and things, and we'll look at that more in detail later. So that's your abiotic components. Notice I put ... at the end here. There's many more that can go in there. Things like altitude, things like pH, a number of other non-living abiotic factors. And remember we did the free response question that shows you water tests. Those were all abiotic things that you could determine just in an aquatic ecosystem. So there's a lot of different variables there. I just put some of the main ones. And then you have your living organisms that live there. So whenever you have two or more populations of organisms, and a population, as we'll see, is all the members of the same species, is one of your pre-test questions. When you have two or more of those in an area, and they are interacting with each other in one way or another, you have an ecosystem. So it can be very simple. It could be that it rained and you have a mud puddle, and that mud puddle sits there for a couple of days. Within probably about a day, you're going to have algae and bacteria that start to grow in it. The algae will produce food. The bacteria will either consume the algae or consume the waste products of the algae, more likely, and then you'll probably also have some protozoans like Paramecia. They might directly consume the algae, and then the algae lives off the waste products from the bacteria, from the decomposers, etc. You have a food chain, you have interaction, they affect each other's environment, and so consequently you have an ecosystem there. The ecosystems can be very large. Our largest ecosystems are called biomes. They can be very small, they can be microscopic. You have ecosystems that exist on your skin because you have bacteria and funguses that normally live there and interact with each other, and it's actually a good thing that we have these things on our bodies. So many different ways to define an ecosystem, and also ecosystems are not isolated. They will always have some input and output that interacts with other ecosystems, so consequently all the ecosystems, it can be said, are tied together, and that of course is what makes our biosphere altogether. So the biosphere is, of course, that relates back to what we studied in the previous unit. We had the lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere. Those are all physical spheres. Those are all part of the biosphere because organisms in the biosphere depend upon all those three physical spheres, and therefore the biosphere is kind of over that, and it's all the living organisms of the Earth as well as the physical environment they interact with. Okay, so that's an important concept to understand. An ecosystem is not just the organisms that live in it, but it's also the physical factors of that ecosystem as well. Now, separate that out, and then if you look at just the organisms that are in an ecosystem, we call that a community. It's kind of like a community that you would have in a town or some area like that. Different organisms interacting with each other, eating, drinking, making babies, having all kinds of organism-like activities. And then within that community, you will have separate populations. A population is all the members of one species. So that's an important concept because the thing that defines a species is it is a group of animals that can reproduce and form more, not animals, excuse me, a group of organisms that can reproduce and form more of that organism. That, of course, is a very important process to keep the species going, and we'll also see it's a vital component in the process of natural selection. We'll look at that later. And then, of course, you have your individual organisms after that. Okay. So, one of the primary relationships you have, you could possibly say the most primary relationship or most important relationship you have in an ecosystem is a food chain. Organisms feeding each other, basically. And that starts from non-food or non-biological and even non-organic substances coming together and being made into food substances by one particular part of that food chain, which is the producer. Now, a lot of times you start with the food chain with the producer, but I want to go ahead and make sure you understand the components that go into that and a concept about food that is important for you to understand. First of all, food is matter, which is obtained from the soil, the air, and the water. Remember, those are our three spheres also represented here, soil as being part of the lithosphere, air and water, of course. And then you have an energy component. So if you looked at, let's see, Mr. Rasmussen's got an item of food up here, if you don't mind. Magnesium, iron, phosphorus. And then you've got, so those are your minerals, right? And then you've got protein, carbohydrates, fats, etc. Those are biological molecules. And then you've got one more value on there that tells you the energy part of that. What is that in a food label? What tells the calories, right? So that kind of, you can look at a food label and kind of sum all this up. So the minerals, etc. Carbon dioxide comes out of the water, out of the air, water, of course, from the water. Or if it's an aquatic plant, it's dissolved in the water. And then your soil primarily contributes your minerals, like I mentioned, magnesium, phosphorus, calcium, those kind of things. Now, those are the only ones that are listed on there because they're important to diet, but you've got a whole bunch of other things you get from there. And, of course, your sunlight supplies the energy. And then your producers can then take that and make biological molecules out of it, what we call food, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and more, okay, from there, okay? So that's produced by the producer, and then you've got your consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary consumer. Now, one of the items that a lot of people missed on the pretest was which one is at the lowest trophic level. And you had deer, spider, I don't know what the other ones were, but those are two main ones that were answered. And many of you got it wrong in saying that the spider was. I'm guessing, assuming that was because the spider is small. Which one was the actual one that's at the bottom of that particular food chain choices?
The deer.
Yeah, the deer, because it's a what? Primary consumer. Now, different things happen. The deer might actually eat a spider. They probably do while they're eating their grass and stuff like that. So you can't always look at what they eat all at different times, because most things are omnivorous. But the best way to determine where something actually falls in the food chain is look at its adaptations for getting food. So a deer, for example, if you looked at its teeth, you would see it's designed to eat grass and plants, etc. Its digestive system would be geared mainly towards that. A spider, on the other hand, it has venom. It creates a web for catching its prey most of the time. And also it produces these digestive enzymes that can dissolve the inside of bugs and things like that. So they're primarily carnivorous. They're at the top of the insect food chain. So that's the way we need to look at it. The point being is that these steps along the food chain, or what we call trophic levels, they're not real strict categories. It's something that's always this, that, or the other thing, but it's what they eat mainly. And like I said, one of the ways you can tell that is by what they're adapted to as far as consumption and those kind of things. So you go down the food chain, and then you got decomposers. Now, decomposers are not really at the end of the food chain here. It's important to understand that decomposers consume the waste products from all stages of the food chain. They reside in the soil. They are not scavengers or something that's known as detritivores that simply just eat dead organisms. Yet are still animals, like worms and vultures and lots of insects that eat mainly dead stuff. They're not considered to be decomposers. Decomposers are bacteria and funguses, primarily, living in the soil. And the thing that makes them different is that they can actually break down food products completely, releasing all the carbon in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and leaving as their waste product mineral nutrients, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, that kind of stuff, nitrates, phosphates, or it's a phosphorus, but those minerals, those inorganic minerals that we call fertilizer. And as you may notice, I mentioned that on the list of things on a nutrition label. And therefore, plants need that. Plants cannot absorb organic food products. And our waste is actually that. When you poop, you've got fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, just like when you eat it. You can try bite of it if you want sometime to test that theory. But if you have rabbits, you may know that they actually have two different poops. One is for eating again because it's not completely digested, and one is for actually is done with. Okay, so a little weird fun fact there, but fact is that waste products, and also of course the other part of waste is dead organisms. So when you die, your tissues are still there. They're not inorganic minerals that plants can live off of. However, usually in nature, when that happens, you're going to fall down in the soil. Or you're going to do your business, so to speak, you leave your waste products in the soil. Then the bacteria and funguses can break it down and make it available to the plants. That's why we have an arrow going back in towards the producers. So very important part of that. A lot of you got that in the pre-test question about how their function is to recycle nutrients. So make sure you understand that, and also make sure you understand the difference between food and inorganic minerals and stuff like that. All right, so 10% energy and nutrients, I'll take that. Really what we're looking at is a more basic level, matter, which is what food is, energy and matter. Only about 10% of that goes from one of these trophic levels to the next. When you eat something, a lot of it gets excreted. If you're actively growing or if you're repairing from injury and things like that, then that's going to go into your body. But a lot of it just gets burned up. The energy gets used by you through your different processes you use it for, and a lot of it's actually given off as waste heat. That's why our bodies generate heat. Now, so consequently, only about 10% of it, on average, gets stored within the body of that organism. And it's that part that gets stored that is going to be available to whatever eats that organism. Okay? So each step of the food chain only gets about 10% of what the step below it got. Okay, so what that means is that when you look at an ecosystem, you look at the number of organisms by mass in an ecosystem, you'll have about 10 times as many producers as primary consumers, 10 times as many primary consumers as secondary consumers, and so on. So your ecosystem, if you looked at it, if you broke it down into how many organisms were in each one or by mass, then you'd have a bunch of producers here. Like if you go out in the woods, that's what you see is mainly plants, right? And then maybe you see some squirrels, about 1/10 as many squirrels by mass as the vegetative, or actually primary consumers in general. And then you might, if you're lucky, you might see a snake, 1/10 is that, and then maybe a hawk up at the top. They're going to be lower and lower numbers as you go up the food chain. Okay, so this gives us an idea of an ecosystem structure. Any typical ecosystem, you got mostly producers, followed by primary consumers, then by secondary consumers, and so on. This also leads to an environmental impact effect that comes from human anthropogenic activity, because we tend to either produce toxins in the case of pesticides and stuff, or bring them to the surface in case of mining with things like mercury and things like that, or burning coal also releases that in the environment. And one of the things to understand that happens first of all when many organisms encounter these toxic substances is that they don't consume them. They don't break them down or degrade them. They actually accumulate. Hopefully I spelled that right. They build them up in their tissues. This is done so that that toxin doesn't go through and harm the organisms, all the systems of that particular organism, going through the digestive system, going through the blood system, the kidney, and the kidneys are particularly sensitive to things. So a strategy for that is that organisms tend to, once they encounter it, and this is usually done by the liver in vertebrate organisms, is it pushes it off usually into fat tissue. Okay. So what that means is over time, the older and older an organism is that is exposed to toxins in its environment, the more toxins it will have in it. Okay. This also means that these toxins are not going to get metabolized and broken down and excreted like your other food, and end up only passing about 10% to the next level. They will pass at a much higher level to the next step of the food chain. Okay. So when that happens, you have to picture, and I've got a diagram to illustrate this better, but you have to picture the fact that the same amount of toxins going to the next level of the food chain, but at that next level of the food chain, there's much less organism, much less what we call biomass. So therefore, the toxin becomes more concentrated, and that process is called biomagnification. Okay, because the toxin remains about the same, whereas the biomass decreases. So it's like a fraction. You know, we're looking at concentrations. You've got the concentration of toxin over the amount of toxin, the mass of toxin over the mass of body tissue, what we call biomass. And since that bottom number decreases as you go up, just like a fraction, that means the overall value gets greater as the denominator decreases. Okay. Any questions about that? Bioaccumulation versus biomagnification. Like I said, there's some diagrams in the presentation we'll talk about in a little bit. If we have time, or next time. Finally, productivity is simply the amount of photosynthesis that's taking place in an ecosystem, typically measured by oxygen output. Which, by the way, that leads us back here. Producers, the main thing that they're producing for the food chain is glucose. Remember that question on the test? A lot of you got that wrong on the pre-test. And then glucose is used to make all the other biological molecules. Oxygen is a byproduct. But we can use it to study how much photosynthesis is going on in an ecosystem per particular area. And so that's one measurement. And then the other one is the biodiversity. We've talked about that quite a bit. Another term for biodiversity is species richness. So productivity is going to be how much photosynthesis is going on in a certain area, like a square meter of that ecosystem. And biodiversity is going to be how many organisms there are, how many different species there are within a particular area. And then finally, the gross primary productivity is the total amount of that photosynthesis going on. But part of that photosynthesis, the glucose is produced, is actually used by the plant. Plants actually respire. I'm going to take cellular because it is accurate. But the word that I was looking for here is plant respiration. Plants do take in oxygen from the atmosphere, actually usually in through their roots. And they do use that through the process of respiration to break down the glucose they produced. So what that means is that if you have a situation where there's a lot of plant respiration also going on, they're going to use a lot of that food themselves. Therefore, they're not going to pass as much on to the next level of food chain. That amount that they pass on to the next level of food chain is known as the net primary productivity. I know it's a little bit much to absorb right now. We'll go into more details about that later, but any questions about productivity versus species richness or biodiversity, that kind of thing? Okay? All right, that's it for today.